Let me ask you something. What happens when heavily armored German knights, the most fearsome warriors in medieval Europe, charge across frozen ice to crush an Orthodox Russian army they consider heretics? What happens when that ice, groaning under the weight of thousands of tons of steel and horseflesh, starts to crack? You're about to find out. And I promise you, the answer involves one of the most innovative tactical victories in medieval history. 15,000 Russian soldiers facing 20,000 German crusaders and their allies. A battle fought on a frozen lake in the middle of a brutal northern winter. A young prince named Alexander Nevsky who turned terrain into a weapon and heavy armor into a death sentence. And hundreds of German knights, the elite of the Teutonic Order, drowning in freezing water, dragged under by the very armor that was supposed to protect them. This is the Battle of Lake Peipus, also called the Battle on the Ice. April 5, 1242. The day Alexander Nevsky stopped the German conquest of Russia dead in its tracks. The day Western crusaders learned that Orthodox Russia would not be converted at sword point, and the day ice became a graveyard. This wasn't just another medieval battle. This was a clash of civilizations. Catholic German crusaders, backed by the Pope, pushing east to convert or conquer Orthodox Christians and pagans. The Teutonic Knights, a military order like the Templars, had spent decades conquering the Baltic region. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Now they were pushing into Russian lands, capturing cities, building castles, planning to incorporate Orthodox Rus into Catholic Christendom. And standing in their way was a 21-year-old prince who understood that sometimes the best weapon isn't a sword, it's the ground beneath your enemy's feet. Before we dive into exactly how Alexander pulled off this tactical masterpiece, here's what I need from you. If this video shows you a battle where intelligence beat brute force, where terrain became a weapon, and where armored knights drowned under ice, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what shocked you most. And subscribe, because we're telling the stories that prove warfare is about brains as much as swords. No oversimplified crusader narratives, no romanticized knights, just Alexander Nevsky outsmarting an enemy that thought they were invincible. That's all I'm asking. Now let's go back 782 years and watch Alexander turn a frozen lake into a killing field. To understand the Battle of Lake Peipus, you need to understand the Northern Crusades. While most people know about crusades to the Holy Land, fewer know about the Crusades in northeastern Europe. Starting in the late 12th century, the Pope authorized crusades against pagans in the Baltic region. German knights, particularly the Teutonic Order, led these campaigns. Their goal was to conquer, convert, and colonize. The Teutonic Knights were one of the great military orders. Founded during the Third Crusade, they'd shifted focus from the Holy Land to the Baltic by the early 13th century. They were professional warriors, trained from youth, bound by monastic vows, and equipped with the best armor and weapons money could buy. They fought as heavy cavalry, using the shock charge to break enemy lines, and they were incredibly successful. By the 1230s, they'd conquered Prussia, Estonia, and were pushing into Livonia and Lithuania. But the Teutonic Order wanted more. East of their territories lay the lands of Rus, the medieval Russian principalities. These were Orthodox Christian, not Catholic. To the Teutonic Knights and the Pope, Orthodox Christians were heretics, barely better than pagans. Converting them to Catholicism or bringing them under papal authority was considered legitimate crusading. So in the 1240s, the Teutonic Order, allied with Danish crusaders and Swedish forces, began pushing into Russian territory. The Russian principalities were in crisis. The Mongol invasions of 1237–1240 had devastated Rus. Cities were burned. Populations were slaughtered or enslaved. The Mongol horde now demanded tribute from Russian princes. Political unity was shattered. Each principality was focused on survival, not coordinating defense. The Teutonic Knights saw opportunity. With the Russians weakened and disorganized, conquest would be easy. Novgorod, in northwestern Russia, was one of the few principalities that had avoided Mongol conquest. It was a wealthy trading city, connected to the Baltic trade networks and fiercely independent. But in 1240–1241, Novgorod faced attacks from multiple directions. Swedes attacked from the north. Alexander Nevsky, Prince of Novgorod, defeated them at the Neva River in 1240, earning his surname Nevsky from that battle. But then the Teutonic Knights attacked from the west. In 1241, the Teutonic Order captured Pskov, a city allied with Novgorod. They installed a Catholic bishop, built fortifications, and used it as a base for raids deeper into Russian territory. Novgorod was next. The boyars, Novgorod's ruling class, panicked. They needed military leadership, but Alexander had left the city after political disputes with the boyars. He was in exile, so Novgorod's leaders swallowed their pride and sent messengers begging Alexander to return. Alexander Nevsky was young, probably in his early 20s. But he'd already proven himself a capable commander at the Battle of the Neva. He understood tactics, logistics, and politics. When Novgorod's delegation found him and begged him to return, Alexander negotiated. He wanted full military authority, resources, and political support. The boyars agreed. They had no choice. In early 1242, Alexander returned to Novgorod and began preparing for war. Alexander's first move was to retake Pskov. He assembled an army, maybe 10,000 to 15,000 men, a mix of Novgorod's militia, professional soldiers, and allied troops from other Russian principalities. In March 1242, Alexander besieged Pskov. The city's German garrison, outnumbered and isolated, surrendered after a brief siege. Alexander executed the German leaders and installed Russian administrators. Pskov was liberated, but Alexander knew this was just the beginning. The Teutonic Order would respond with a much larger force. They couldn't let the loss of Pskov go unanswered, so Alexander had to decide: defend Novgorod behind its walls or meet the Teutonic Knights in the field. He chose to fight, but he needed to choose the battlefield carefully. The Teutonic Order assembled a large army to crush Alexander. The exact size is debated, but most historians estimate 10,000 to 12,000 German and Danish knights and soldiers, plus another 8,000 to 10,000 Estonian and Livonian auxiliaries conscripted from conquered territories. Total force, maybe 20,000 men. The core was heavy cavalry, the Teutonic Knights themselves, and allied German nobles. These were the elite, equipped with the best armor, trained for decades, and confident in their superiority. Alexander's army was smaller, maybe 15,000 men. Most were infantry, foot soldiers equipped with spears, axes, and shields. He had some cavalry, light horsemen who could skirmish and pursue, but couldn't match German knights in a frontal charge. His troops were tough, used to harsh conditions, defending their homeland. But they were outmatched in equipment and training compared to the Teutonic Knights. Alexander knew a traditional battle would be suicide. If the German knights charged his infantry on open ground, they'd break his lines and slaughter his army. He needed an advantage. He needed terrain that would neutralize the German heavy cavalry. And he found it: Lake Peipus. Lake Peipus is a large lake on the border between modern Estonia and Russia. In April 1242, it was frozen solid. The ice was thick enough to support men and horses. Alexander's plan was audacious. He'd lure the Teutonic Knights onto the ice. His light-equipped troops could move easily on the slippery surface. The Germans, in full armor, would struggle, and if the ice cracked under their weight, the heavily armored knights would drown. The plan required precise execution. Alexander positioned his army on the eastern shore of the lake, near a place called Raven Rock. He deployed his infantry in a formation that looked weak and vulnerable, inviting attack. His cavalry he hid on the flanks, concealed by trees and terrain. The trap was set. Now he had to wait for the Germans to walk into it. On April 5, 1242, the Teutonic Knights' army approached Lake Peipus. Their scouts reported Alexander's army on the far shore. The Germans saw a smaller force, seemingly poorly positioned, on ice. Their commanders debated. Some advised caution. Fighting on ice was dangerous. Others argued this was the perfect opportunity to destroy Alexander's army in one decisive engagement. Confidence won, The Teutonic Knights decided to attack. The German heavy cavalry formed up on the western shore, thousands of armored knights on armored horses. The ground shook as they prepared to charge. The plan was simple: charge across the ice, smash into the Russian center, break their formation, and slaughter the fleeing survivors. It was the standard Teutonic tactic, and it had worked dozens of times before. No reason it wouldn't work now. The charge began. Thousands of German knights thundered across the frozen lake. The sound was like an avalanche. Hooves on ice, armor clanking, men shouting war cries. From Alexander's position, it must have looked terrifying. A wall of steel and horseflesh bearing down at speed. The Russian infantry in the center braced themselves. The impact was tremendous. The German knights smashed into the Russian center. Lances impaled men, horses trampled foot soldiers. The Russian center buckled under the pressure. Men fell back, fighting desperately, but the German charge had momentum. The Teutonic Knights pushed forward, confident they were winning. Their formation drove deeper into the Russian lines. This was exactly what Alexander wanted. The Russian retreat was planned. As the German knights pushed forward, they bunched up. Their formation compressed as they pursued the retreating Russians. Units lost spacing. Horses slipped on the ice, and the weight, thousands of tons of men, horses, and armor, concentrated on a relatively small area of frozen lake. Then Alexander sprang his trap. His cavalry, hidden on the flanks, charged out from concealment and slammed into the German flanks and rear. Simultaneously, the Russian infantry stopped retreating and counterattacked. The Germans, who thought they were winning, suddenly found themselves surrounded. The Teutonic Knights tried to respond. They were professional soldiers, trained for chaos, but the ice was treacherous. Horses couldn't maneuver properly. The slippery surface meant knights couldn't maintain formation. And the weight of their armor, which protected them in normal combat, became a liability. Knights in full-plate armor couldn't move quickly on ice. When they fell, they struggled to get back up. The Russian troops, lighter and more mobile, exploited this. They attacked from multiple directions, using spears and axes to pull knights from horses or kill horses to unhorse riders. A knight on the ground, in heavy armor on ice, was helpless. Russian soldiers would swarm them, stabbing through gaps in armor or simply holding them down until they could be killed or captured. And then the ice began to crack. The exact extent is debated by historians. Chronicle accounts, written decades later, claim massive sections of ice collapsed, drowning hundreds of German knights. Modern historians are skeptical, noting that chronicles exaggerated for dramatic effect, but something happened. Whether large sections of ice gave way or just localized cracking, the effect was psychological terror. Knights heard ice groaning and cracking under them. Some areas did give way, and knights in full armor who fell through ice had no chance. The weight of their armor dragged them under. They drowned within minutes, unable to swim, unable to escape. The psychological impact was devastating. German knights, who'd charged confidently minutes before, now panicked. Some tried to retreat back across the lake. Others tried to fight their way to shore. Units lost cohesion. The battle dissolved into hundreds of individual fights, and the Russians had the advantage in this chaos. Alexander's cavalry pursued relentlessly. German knights trying to flee on ice were easy targets. Russian horsemen, lighter and more agile, caught them, pulled them down, and killed them. The pursuit extended for kilometers. Bodies and abandoned equipment littered the frozen lake. Blood stained the white ice red. By late afternoon, the battle was over. The Teutonic Knights' army was destroyed. Casualties are hard to estimate precisely. Chronicles claim 400 to 500 German knights killed and 50 captured, with thousands of auxiliaries dead or scattered. Modern estimates are more conservative, but even skeptical historians agree the Teutonic Order suffered a catastrophic defeat. More importantly, the psychological blow was immense. The invincible German crusaders had been humiliated by a young Russian prince on a frozen lake. Alexander returned to Novgorod a hero. The city erupted in celebration. He'd saved them from conquest, freed Pskov, and destroyed an army that threatened all of Rus. His reputation spread across the Russian principalities and beyond. He became a symbol of resistance against foreign invaders, both German crusaders and Mongol overlords. The Teutonic Order, reeling from the defeat, withdrew from Russian territory. They focused on consolidating their holdings in the Baltic. Plans to conquer Novgorod and expand into Orthodox Russia were abandoned. Lake Peipus had proven that Russians could and would fight back. The cost of conquest was too high. Let's analyze what actually happened at Lake Peipus. How did 15,000 Russians defeat 20,000 Germans and their allies? The answer is terrain, tactics, and psychology. Terrain first. Alexander chose to fight on a frozen lake deliberately. The ice neutralized the German heavy cavalry's main advantage: shock charge on solid ground. On ice, horses couldn't build speed properly, couldn't turn quickly, couldn't charge in tight formation without risking slips. The Germans' strength became a weakness, and the weight of their armor, normally an asset, became a liability when ice cracked. Tactics. Alexander used a feigned retreat to draw the Germans in, then surrounded them with flanking cavalry. This is classic tactical maneuvering, but executing it requires discipline. The Russian center had to retreat convincingly without actually breaking, then counterattack on command. That requires training and trust. Alexander's troops executed it perfectly. Psychology. The Germans were confident, possibly overconfident. They saw a smaller enemy on bad terrain and assumed easy victory. They charged without proper reconnaissance, without considering that ice might be a trap. That overconfidence led them into the killing ground. Once the trap closed, the psychological shock, combined with the terror of ice cracking, broke their morale. The ice breaking is the most debated aspect. Russian chronicles describe knights drowning en masse. German chronicles barely mention it or deny it happened. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Some ice likely cracked, especially where the heaviest concentration of knights bunched up. Some knights probably drowned. But the main cause of German casualties was the tactical encirclement, not ice failure. The ice breaking became a legendary detail that overshadowed the actual tactical brilliance. What's certain is that Alexander used terrain as a weapon. He understood that heavy cavalry on ice was vulnerable. He positioned his army to exploit that vulnerability, and he executed a complex tactical plan that required timing, coordination, and discipline. That's not luck. That's military genius. The human cost was significant. Hundreds of German knights dead, drowned, or captured. Thousands of auxiliaries killed or scattered. Russian casualties were probably lower, maybe a few hundred to 1,000, mostly from the initial German charge before the trap closed. But every death, German or Russian, was a man who died in freezing conditions, far from home, fighting over territorial and religious disputes. For the Teutonic knights who drowned, death was particularly horrific. Imagine falling through ice in full armor. The water is freezing, near 0 degrees. You sink immediately, the armor too heavy to fight against. You can't swim. You can't remove the armor underwater. You have maybe a minute before hypothermia and drowning kill you. Panic, terror, and then nothing. That was the fate of knights who'd trained their entire lives for combat, only to die helpless in a frozen lake. For Alexander, Lake Peipus was the defining moment of his career. He was 21 or 22 years old. He won a major battle against one of Europe's premier military forces. His reputation was made. He'd go on to rule Novgorod and later Vladimir, navigating the complex politics of dealing with both Mongol overlords and Western threats. He'd become known as a pragmatist who knew when to fight and when to negotiate. But Lake Peipus remained his greatest military achievement. The battle had immediate and long-term consequences. Immediately, it ended Teutonic expansion into Russia. The order withdrew, focused on the Baltic, and never seriously threatened Novgorod again. This preserved Orthodox Christianity in Russia. If the Teutonic Knights had conquered Novgorod, they would have attempted forced conversion to Catholicism, as they did in Baltic territories. Lake Peipus stopped that. Long-term, the battle became a foundational myth in Russian national identity. Alexander Nevsky became a national hero, canonized as a saint by the Orthodox Church. The battle was commemorated in art, literature, and film. Most famously, Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein made a film, Alexander Nevsky, in 1938, using the battle as anti-German propaganda. The film is historically inaccurate in many details, but captures the mythic significance of the battle for Russian identity. The battle also influenced military thinking about terrain. Commanders studying Lake Peipus learned that terrain could be weaponized, that seemingly solid ground could become a trap, and that understanding local conditions was as important as troop numbers. It's one of the clearest examples of environmental warfare before the modern era. There's a question about the religious framing. Was Lake Peipus really a clash of civilizations, Catholic versus Orthodox, or was it a territorial conflict dressed up in religious language? Probably both. The Teutonic Knights genuinely believed they were spreading Christianity and serving God. Alexander genuinely believed he was defending Orthodox faith against heretical crusaders. But both sides were also fighting for land, resources, and political power. Religion provided justification and motivation, but the conflict had material causes too. The Teutonic Order's perspective is worth considering. From their viewpoint, they were civilizing barbarians and heretics. They'd successfully conquered pagan territories and brought them into Christendom. Russian Orthodox princes who allied with Mongol pagans looked like targets for conversion. Lake Peipus was, from their perspective, a setback, but not unjust aggression. Medieval holy war logic allowed this. Both sides thought God was on their side. Alexander's relationship with the Mongols is complex. He was fighting Germans in 1242, but he also paid tribute to the Mongol Golden Horde. He made multiple trips to the Mongol court, kowtowing to Khans, bringing gifts, securing his position as prince. Some Russian historians criticize him for collaborating with Mongols. Others argue he had no choice. The Mongols were too powerful to fight. By allying with them, he preserved Novgorod's autonomy and prevented devastation. Lake Peipus gave him the military credibility to negotiate with Mongols from a position of relative strength. The captured German knights were ransomed eventually. Medieval warfare had established protocols for prisoner treatment, especially for nobles. Knights were valuable, their families would pay ransoms. Alexander held them until payments arrived, then released them. Some prisoners converted to Orthodoxy and entered Russian service. Others returned west and never fought in Rus again. The battlefield today is difficult to pinpoint exactly. Lake Peipus is huge, and ice conditions change yearly. Russian and Estonian historians debate the precise location. Archaeological evidence is sparse. Weapons and armor from the bottom of a lake 800 years later are hard to find. But commemorative sites exist on both shores, and the battle is remembered by local populations. There's a modern geopolitical dimension. Russia invokes Alexander Nevsky and Lake Peipus as symbols of resistance against Western aggression. During the Cold War, the battle was used as propaganda against NATO. Even today, references to Alexander Nevsky appear in Russian political rhetoric when discussing relations with the West. This shows how historical memory can be weaponized for contemporary purposes. If you're still watching, I want your thoughts. Was Alexander's victory primarily tactical brilliance or lucky ice-breaking? Could the Teutonic Knights have won with different tactics? And how would Russian history have changed if Alexander had lost? Drop your answers in the comments. Let's debate this properly. And if this story showed you a battle where terrain became the decisive weapon, where a young commander outsmarted a more powerful enemy, hit that subscribe button. We are building a community that values tactical innovation over brute force, intelligence over numbers, and real history over myths. That's what we do here. Lake Peipus matters because it shows that military success isn't just about who has the bigger army or better equipment. It's about understanding conditions, exploiting enemy weaknesses, and having the intelligence to turn disadvantages into advantages. Alexander was outnumbered. His troops were less heavily armed. But he chose the battlefield, set the trap, and executed a plan that turned German strengths into liabilities. That's not just winning a battle, That's redefining what victory looks like. The lesson of Lake Peipus is that environments matter. Terrain, weather, local conditions, these aren't just background. They're factors that skilled commanders manipulate. Alexander didn't accept the battle the Germans wanted to fight. He created a battle where his lighter troops had the advantage. Modern military doctrine calls this shaping the battlefield. Alexander did it 800 years ago on a frozen lake. Now you know what happened at Lake Peipus. Not a mythical story where ice swallowed an army, but a carefully planned tactical victory where a brilliant young commander used terrain to offset numerical and technological disadvantages. You know why it mattered for Russian history, why the Teutonic Knights never conquered Novgorod, and why Alexander Nevsky became a legend. That's the real story. That's what we do here. Real history, where victories come from intelligence as much as courage, where environments become weapons, and where understanding what actually happened is more interesting than the legend. More stories coming. More battles where the smaller force won through superior tactics. More moments where history turned on smart decisions made in seconds. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.